I was 23 when this happened, working as a night shift pathology technician at a massive county hospital in Chicago. Because it was a county hospital, we got everything. Car accidents, homicides, John Does found in alleyways. My job was straightforward. Receive the bodies from the transport teams, log their personal effects, tag them, and place them into the cold storage wall until the medical examiner arrived in the morning. The morgue was located in sub-basement level 2. It was a sprawling, sterile labyrinth of white tiles, stainless steel, and harsh fluorescent lighting. At 2 a.m., it was just me and a security guard named Marcus, whose desk was situated about 50 yards down the hall from the main prep room. It was a Tuesday in mid-November. The weather outside was freezing, sleet hammering the streets above. But down in the sub-basement, it was always a perfectly climate-controlled 60 degrees. Around 2:45 a.m., the service elevator dinged. 2 paramedics rolled a gurney down the hall. On it was a black body bag. They looked exhausted. "John Doe," the older paramedic said, handing me the clipboard. "Found in an abandoned warehouse over by the rail yards. Exposure, mostly. Maybe something else. The ME will figure it out tomorrow." I signed the paperwork, they took their empty gurney, and the heavy double doors swung shut behind them, leaving me alone with the black bag. I wheeled the transport cart into the center of the main prep room. I put on my thick latex gloves, grabbed my clipboard, and unzipped the bag. The man inside looked to be in his late 40s. He was incredibly emaciated, wearing rags that were soaked through with freezing rain. His skin was a pale, waxy gray, and his eyes were closed. Standard intake. I checked his pockets for ID. Nothing. I took his fingerprints using the digital scanner, wrote "John Doe, unknown" on a toe tag, and tied it around his right big toe. Tag number 409. I rolled him over to the cold storage wall. This wall is basically a giant grid of heavy metal doors, like oversized filing cabinets. I opened door number 12, slid his tray inside, shut the heavy door with a solid clank, and latched it. I went back to my desk in the adjoining office to log his intake on the computer. For about 20 minutes, the only sound was the clicking of my keyboard and the low, constant hum of the refrigeration units. Then, the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual. The hospital was old, and storms often messed with the grid. The backup generators would usually kick in instantly. The overhead lights buzzed, dimmed to a sickening yellow, then shut off completely. I was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. I sat there for a second, waiting for the emergency backup lights to turn on. 5 seconds passed. 10. Nothing. A cold knot started to form in my stomach. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam of light cut through the dark office, illuminating the glass window that looked out into the main prep room. I stood up, planning to walk down the hall to ask Marcus if the whole building had lost power. But as I shined my light through the glass into the prep room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Door number 12 on the cold storage wall was wide open. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd physically latched that door. I vividly remembered the heavy metallic sound it made. Furthermore, those doors are incredibly heavy and operate on a vacuum seal. They do not just pop open on their own. I slowly pushed the office door open and stepped into the prep room. The silence was deafening. Without the hum of the refrigeration units, the room felt like a tomb. I kept my phone flashlight trained on door 12. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed off the tile walls, sounding small and weak. I walked closer, my shoes squeaking loudly on the linoleum. When I reached the wall, I shined my light inside Unit 12. The tray was pulled out, and it was completely empty. A wave of pure, unfiltered panic washed over me. Dead bodies do not get up and walk away. It is scientifically, fundamentally impossible.
I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I swept the beam of light across the room. Stainless steel tables, surgical sinks, empty carts, nothing. Then I heard it. Slap, drag. It came from the far corner of the room, near the drainage sinks. It was the distinct sound of wet, bare skin peeling off the tile floor, followed by the heavy weight. Slap, drag. I swallowed hard, my mouth completely dry. I slowly moved my flashlight beam toward the sound. Crouched in the corner, wedged between the sink and the wall, was a pale, naked figure. Its back was to me. It was shivering violently, its spine protruding against its gray skin. It was the John Doe, tag 409. I couldn't breathe. My mind couldn't process what I was looking at. Was he in a medically induced coma? Had his core temperature dropped so low that the paramedics couldn't find a pulse and the warmth of the hospital had revived him? Sir, please don't move. I'm gonna get a doctor. The shivering stopped immediately. The figure slowly turned its head to look at me over its shoulder. In the harsh glare of my flashlight, I saw its eyes. They weren't the confused, disoriented eyes of a man waking up from a coma. They were completely dilated, pitch black, and staring at me with an expression of pure, predatory malice. The man didn't stand up. Instead, he dropped onto all fours, his joints popping loudly in the quiet room. I didn't wait to see what he was going to do next. I turned and sprinted toward the double doors. I hit the metal push bar with my entire body weight, bursting out into the hallway. I screamed for Marcus. I heard heavy, wet footsteps slapping against the tile right behind me. "Marcus!" I screamed again, running frantically down the dark hallway. The beam of Marcus's heavy magnolite cut through the darkness ahead. He saw me running and drew his sidearm. "What is it? What's wrong?" he yelled. I crashed into him, spinning around to point my phone flashlight down the hallway I had just run from. It was empty. We waited for the emergency lights to finally kick on 5 minutes later. When they did, Marcus and I slowly walked back to the prep room, his gun drawn. We searched every square inch of the sub-basement, the prep room, the storage closets, the locker rooms. The John Doe was gone. The only evidence that he had ever been there was the wet trail of bare footprints leading from the cold storage wall, past the sinks and directly to the service elevator doors, which had been pried open. Inside the dark elevator shaft, echoing from far above us, was the faint, rhythmic sound of metal creaking. Someone or something climbing the greased cables to the surface. I quit my job the very next morning. The hospital officially classified it as a mistake by the paramedics, a severe case of catalepsy that mimicked death. But I saw the way that thing looked at me. Whatever they brought down to me that night, it wasn't a man who had woken up. It was something that had just been waiting for the dark.
I spent 4 years working as an assistant at a family-owned funeral home in upstate New York. It was a massive Victorian-era house that had been converted in the 1950s. The main floor was all plush carpets, velvet curtains, and viewing rooms. The upstairs was an apartment where the owner, Mr. Gable, lived. But the basement, that was where the actual work happened. It housed the embalming room, the cold storage, and the massive industrial crematorium oven. It was late January, right in the middle of a massive nor'easter. The snow was falling so thick you couldn't see 10 feet out the window, and the wind was howling around the old house like a pack of wolves. Because of the storm, all the other staff had gone home early. I was the only one left, tasked with finishing the prep work on a woman who was scheduled for a viewing the next afternoon. Mr. Gable was upstairs in his apartment, presumably asleep.
The basement was entirely concrete, making it permanently chilly and incredibly prone to echoing. I had the radio on low, playing a classic rock station just to break up the silence. At around 11:30 p.m., I finished the embalming process. I washed my instruments, took off my apron, and rolled the gurney into the walk-in cold storage unit. The cold room was essentially a giant insulated meat locker. Thick metal walls, industrial cooling fans blasting freezing air from the ceiling, and rows of metal racks holding body bags. We currently had 5 bodies in storage. I wheeled the woman to an empty spot, locked the wheels, and turned to leave. As I reached for the heavy silver handle on the inside of the freezer door, the lights in the cold room flickered and died. I groaned out loud. The storm must have finally knocked out the power. I wasn't worried. The door opened from the inside with a simple push mechanism. I pressed my weight against the heavy silver latch. It didn't budge. I frowned, pushing harder. The mechanism clicked, but the door wouldn't swing open. It felt like something heavy was wedged against it on the outside. "Hey!" I yelled, pounding my fist against the thick metal. "Mr. Gable, are you down here?" No answer. The heavy insulation of the walls absorbed my voice instantly. I pulled out my cell phone. No service, of course. I was in a metal box in a concrete basement. I turned on the flashlight app. The harsh white light swept across the silver body bags lining the racks. The temperature was dropping fast now that the main building's heating was off, but the freezer's internal fans were still slowly spinning down, blowing residual ice-cold air on my neck. I walked back to the door and threw my shoulder into it. It moved maybe half an inch before hitting something solid. Someone had jammed it from the outside. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "It's just an old building," I muttered to myself. "Something fell against it. Mr. Gable will come down to check the generator soon." I turned my back to the door and leaned against it, shining my light around the small room to preserve battery. That was when I noticed the zipper on the body bag on the middle rack. I knew for a fact that I had zipped all of them completely shut. It was standard protocol. But the bag holding a young man who had died in a motorcycle accident the day before was unzipped about 6 inches at the top. I stared at it. My mind raced to find a logical explanation. Gases expanding? Careless mistake by another tech earlier that day? I took a tentative step forward. The concrete floor was freezing through the soles of my shoes. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling incredibly stupid to talk to a corpse. As I watched, the zipper slowly, methodically moved down another 2 inches. Zzz, zzz. My blood ran completely cold. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped in a sealed metal room, and something was opening that bag from the inside. I backed up until my spine hit the freezer door. I gripped the heavy metal handle behind my back with both hands, pulling at it desperately, but it was still wedged tight. A pale, bruised hand slipped out from the opening of the black bag. Its fingers gripped the plastic, knuckles turning white with tension. Then a second hand emerged. It gripped the edges of the bag and pulled it completely open. The man from the motorcycle accident sat up. His face was a ruined mess of lacerations and purple bruising, but his eyes were wide open. They were bloodshot, tracking the room with frantic, jerky movements. When his gaze finally locked onto my flashlight beam, he didn't look dead. He looked terrified. He opened his mouth. His jaw hung loosely, unhinged on one side. A wet, gargling rasp came from his throat. "Hiding," he wheezed. His voice sounded like dry leaves crushing together. I dropped my phone. The flashlight hit the concrete, throwing wild shadows against the ceiling. I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the smooth metal. When I brought the light back up, the man was pulling himself off the metal rack. His movements were unnatural, disjointed, like a marionette being controlled by someone who didn't know how to pull the strings. His bare feet hit the freezing concrete with a dull slap. "Stay away from me!" I screamed, pressing myself as flat as I could against the door. He didn't walk toward me. He stumbled past me, throwing his broken body against the opposite wall of the freezer, burying his face into the corner and curling into a tight, trembling ball. He wasn't trying to attack me. He was hiding. Before I could process what was happening, a massive, thunderous bang shook the freezer door behind me. I screamed, spinning around. Bang! 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 Someone on the outside was hammering against the thick metal with something heavy, a sledgehammer or a crowbar. The heavy latch rattled violently. Through the thick metal, I could hear a voice. It was distorted, low, and completely devoid of human emotion. "Let me in," the voice said. It wasn't Mr. Gable. I looked back at the corner. The dead man was pressing his hands over his ears, his broken jaw wide open in a silent scream. Suddenly, the heavy metal door flew open, the wedge on the outside giving way. The emergency lights in the basement had kicked on, casting a dim red glow into the room. Standing in the doorway was a man. He was over 6 feet tall, wearing a heavy, snow-covered parka. His face was entirely obscured by a black ski mask. In his right hand, he held a heavy steel tire iron. He didn't look at me. His eyes immediately locked onto the corner of the room where the dead man was cowering. The intruder stepped into the freezer. He raised the tire iron. I didn't think. I scrambled under the metal racks, crawling on my hands and knees past his heavy boots, and burst out into the embalming room. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the stairs. I heard the sickening, wet crunch of metal hitting bone from inside the freezer, followed by a low, guttural grunt. I ran up the stairs, screaming for Mr. Gable. He had finally woken up and was standing at the top of the stairs with a shotgun. I babbled incoherently about a man in the basement. Mr. Gable racked the shotgun and slowly went down the stairs. I called 911 from the landline in the kitchen. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they cleared the basement. The intruder was gone, having escaped through a ground-level window he had smashed in the crematorium room. But when they looked inside the walk-in freezer, they found a gruesome scene. The young man from the motorcycle accident was lying on the floor, his skull completely caved in by repeated blows from a blunt object. The police assumed someone had broken in to desecrate a corpse, a sick act of post-mortem revenge by an enemy of the deceased, and never understood why the body bag was unzipped or why the corpse was found in the far corner of the room, far from his assigned rack. I know what I saw. I know that man sat up. I know he spoke to me. But I never told the police, because if I told them the truth, they would put me in a psychiatric ward. But I know that whatever that intruder wanted, he wanted to make absolutely sure the job was finished.
I worked security at a major university medical center in California. The campus had a massive, state-of-the-art anatomy lab and morgue in the basement of the science building. This is where medical students would practice on cadavers and where the county occasionally stored overflow bodies during mass casualty events. My shift was 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was usually the most boring job in the world. I would sit at a desk in the main lobby, watch a bank of security monitors, and do a physical patrol of the basement once every 2 hours. It was a Friday night in early October. The campus was mostly empty, students out partying or studying in their dorms. I was drinking my third cup of terrible break room coffee, scrolling through my phone, when I glanced up at the monitor bank. Camera 4, which pointed down the long hallway leading to the cadaver storage room, was acting up. The feed was staticky, rolling with lines of interference, before suddenly cutting to completely black. Great, I muttered.
The university was constantly cutting the facilities budget, and the camera system was ancient. Protocol dictated that I had to physically check any blind spots if a camera went down. I grabbed my heavy mag-light flashlight, clipped my radio to my belt, and took the elevator down to the basement. The basement of the science building always gave me the creeps. Unlike modern hospitals, this place was built in the 1970s. The walls were covered in pale green tiles that looked like they belonged in an old asylum, and the overhead fluorescent tubes hummed with a loud, aggressive buzz. I stepped off the elevator and walked down the main corridor. As I approached the section where camera 4 was located, I aimed my flashlight up at the ceiling. The camera hadn't just malfunctioned. The heavy plastic dome encasing the lens had been completely shattered, as if someone had hit it with a broom handle or a pipe. Shards of plastic littered the linoleum floor. My heart rate instantly spiked. "Control, this is Sarah. I'm in the basement. Camera 4 has been vandalized. I'm going to investigate the cadaver lab." "Copy that, Sarah. Proceed with caution. Do you need me to call PD?" The dispatcher crackled back. "Hold off for now. Might just be frat kids pulling a prank," I replied. I drew my pepper spray with my left hand and held my flashlight in my right. I slowly approached the heavy metal double doors of the cadaver storage room. They were supposed to be locked via keycard access after 8 p.m. I pushed against the right door. It swung open effortlessly. The magnetic lock had been bypassed. A strip of thick black duct tape was plastered over the strike plate, preventing the door from locking. Someone had intentionally secured the door open. I stepped into the lab. The room was massive, lined with dozens of stainless steel tables. Most of them were empty, but about 10 of them had bodies resting on them, completely covered by thick white plastic. The smell of formaldehyde was so strong it made my eyes water. "University security," I barked, trying to sound much more authoritative than I felt. "If anyone is in here, come out now." Silence, just the buzzing of the lights and the hum of the ventilation system. I began to sweep the room, walking slowly between the rows of tables. I checked under the tables, behind the medical supply carts, and inside the storage closets. Nothing. I reached the back of the room, where the massive walk-in refrigeration units were located. These were huge, floor-to-ceiling metal doors where the cadavers were kept before being laid out for the students. I noticed something strange on the floor. Leading away from one of the stainless steel tables, a table that was currently empty, was a trail of wet droplets. They were dark, thick, and glistening in the harsh light. I crouched down, shining my light on the fluid. It wasn't blood. It was embalming fluid. I followed the trail. It led away from the table, snaked between 2 rows of covered bodies, and stopped directly in front of the door to refrigeration Unit B. I stood up, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at the heavy metal handle of the fridge. The handle was smeared with a thick, greasy substance. I keyed my radio. "Control, this is Sarah. Send PD now. We have a break-in." "Copy. PD is en route. ETA 5 minutes. Get out of there, Sarah." I fully intended to turn around and run back to the elevator, but as I took a step backward, a sound stopped me in my tracks. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, and it was coming from inside refrigeration Unit B. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like someone slowly, rhythmically hitting their head against the inside of the thick metal door. I stood paralyzed. Logic dictated that I leave, but human curiosity, that morbid, fatal flaw we all have, rooted me to the spot. What if it was a student? What if someone had been locked inside as a sick prank and was freezing to death? I stepped forward. I grabbed the heavy metal handle. I braced myself, and I pulled the door open. A blast of freezing, chemical-scented air hit my face. I aimed my flashlight into the darkness of the fridge. Hanging from the meat hooks on the ceiling, hooks meant for draining large animals, not humans, were 3 people. They weren't cadavers. They were the 3 frat boys who had gone missing from a campus party 2 days prior. They were stripped naked, their skin blue from the cold, but they weren't dead, not yet. One of them, the boy closest to the door, was swinging his body slightly, his forehead tapping against the metal wall. Thump, thump, thump. His eyes were rolled back in his head, his lips blue and cracked. Before I could scream, I heard a wet, shuffling sound behind me. I spun around, dropping my flashlight. Standing in the aisle, previously concealed beneath one of the white plastic sheets on a medical table, was a man. He was wearing a filthy, blood-stained lab coat. In his hands, he held a bone saw. "You're early," he whispered, his voice echoing in the massive room. I didn't try to use my pepper spray. I didn't try to fight. I turned and sprinted toward the double doors faster than I have ever run in my entire life. I heard the horrifying buzz of the electric bone saw revving to life behind me, followed by heavy footsteps giving chase. I hit the double doors, tearing the duct tape off the strike plate as I threw them shut behind me. I heard the magnetic lock engage with a loud click, just a fraction of a second before a heavy body slammed into the other side of the glass. I backed away, hyperventilating. Through the reinforced wire glass of the door, the man in the lab coat stared at me. He smiled, raised the buzzing bone saw, and tapped it against the glass. Then he turned around and walked back into the cadaver lab toward the open refrigeration unit where the boys were hanging. The police arrived 3 minutes later. They breached the lab with weapons drawn. They found the 3 boys. 2 of them survived, suffering from severe hypothermia and shock. The boy who had been thumping his head against the door, he didn't make it. The man with the saw had gotten to him before the police made it inside. The man in the lab coat was gone. He had vanished into the labyrinth of maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the university. They never caught him. They never figured out how long he had been living in the tunnels, slipping into the lab at night to conduct his own research. I never worked security again, and to this day, whenever I hear the low hum of a refrigerator, my chest tightens, and I have to leave the room.